In the previous video, we looked at making a prototype site in Hype and using placeholders and thinking about basic functionality. And we looked at kind of grouping things and copying animation. In this tutorial, we're just going to look at using a grid in Hype and guides with a view to helping us with layout. And so fundamentally, a grid just helps you to think about kind of scale and proportion and where you place stuff, and then spacing between kind of columns of text, so the gutter spacing and stuff like that. So they're really useful. Often people think that guides are or grids are boring or restricted, but actually they're not. They just help us to do lots of basic things well, and to not have to think too much about certain areas of placement and size, which you'll see in a minute. So they are quite useful, and at the end of the day, you can control how detailed your grid is or how it's set up. So there's a lot of flexibility in using grids. So I would recommend using one just to get things going. So if we look at this example here, this is the screen that we were looking at in the previous video. So we have content coming in, as you'll remember, like this, and these tiles are set up. And you can see that things are in proportion with each other, and that's what the grid will give you. And so it's clear that I've got some kind of system for layout here. And if I just turn my grid on, you can see how it works. Okay, so I've got a number of columns here, and then the content is either in a column or spanning, but we're spanning to proportional values each time. So here a tile, here the home tile is a 2-column width tile, and it goes right up, and then I've got a gutter, which is the same for everything here. And it's the same with the text. So this is kind of what a grid will help you to do. If we look at the second screen here, you can see the same grid is in operation. We've gone to the main content screen here, and this, what would be a large image, is scaled proportionally to multiples of the column. So here we can see that it's spanning 6 columns and particular rows, and so when it scales up, it looks proportional and everything looks designed because they're in multiples. And that's the beauty of the grid, really. That's what it helps you to do. You don't have to think about what size these things should be or have a guess. It will guide you, and there you go. So to make a grid's quite easy in Hype. If we want to do something basic, we can turn rulers on. So you can see around the edges here, I've got the rulers, and we can click and drag from here to create guides like we would in other software. Okay. I'll just unlock that. You can see, here we go. So that's fairly straightforward, and we can use that. We can use that quite fluidly just to line things up, and you know all about that. To make a grid like we've just seen, again in the view menu here, you'll see that we've got guides, which is to add guides horizontally and vertically, and we can do that as a way of making a grid like multiples. But we can also create a grid using the layout grid here. So if we go into layout, create grid, you'll see it'll give me a way of making grids, so a number of columns, I can put more or less in. It's quite self-explanatory, and I can dictate how much gutter space I want between each of those. So here I'm going for 12 columns and a gutter space of 5. Now the grid here will default to being 100% width, which is fine, and we can work with that. Personally, I don't. I like a bit of a kind of some margins around the edges, and so what I do is go into the grid width, but set a pixel ratio. So if you go into the percentage sign here, you see there's a pixel ratio. My the size of my site is 1240 pixels. So if I decide that I want 50 all the way around or 50 on the edges, I can just say 1240, and you'll see I get some kind of margin. So this completely up to you what you do. This is a matter of preference. Personally, I prefer some kind of margin, sort of like you would have in print. You don't have to, but it's just a matter of preference. So I've gone here for a 12 column setup, and then with my gutter of 5. Then if I go back into the view menu to create the rows, I can go into add multiple guides, and here you'll see I have a number of rows or columns I can dictate. If I just go for 8, for instance, you can see I get a grid. So that's how we make the grid. And then, as I was saying just now, when we start to kind of introduce content, so let's just say I want to scale something here, just bring in a rectangle, and I know the kind of sizes I'm working for, and everything can be in proportion. And so you'll see we can click and drag out some content or an element, and it will snap onto those guides. Just run this to the end. You'll see that you can make decisions about the relative size of things based on your grid. So that's how they're useful.